My name is Sasha Korniak. I'm also known as the Cuba Wanderer. I'm originally from London, but now I live in Havana, Cuba. What happened this time last year on Wednesday the 17th of December 2014 and over the last year in the relationship between the United States and Cuba? On Wednesday the 17th of December 2014, I was attending lessons at Havana University and I received a text message to my mobile which I ignored. Moments later, I started to receive phone calls, which were distracting myself and the rest of the class, so I turned off my mobile phone. Simultaneously to this event, there was large conversations being heard echoing across the university corridor just outside the classroom, which was not unusual because of the architecture of the university kind of amplifies these voices in the corridors. But then cheering was heard outside the window in the neighbourhood near to the university and across the whole of Havana. I thought to myself, what on earth was going on? Well, Raul Castro was addressing the nation on television, announcing that the last three members of a group called the Cuban Five or the Miami Five had returned to Cuba. On hearing this news, Havana erupted into a huge celebration, with people, including myself, taking to the streets in a huge celebration in the freedom of these three particular individuals. Diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba were never going to be restored until the freedom of the Cuban Five. To find out more about this, I recommend you read a great book called What Lies Across the Water by Stephen Kimber. It will give you a great explanation of the history of the Cuban Five and why this was so important to restore diplomatic relations with the US. The presidential announcements on that day by Barack Obama and Raul Castro could go down in history as an incredible resistance to imperialistic power in what was an historical approach after 50 years of frozen relations. So is it true now that Cubans and Cuba have nothing to fear from the United States and everything's hunky-dory? Well, not exactly. On the same day as the presidential announcements, the White House issued a new fact sheet entitled Charting a New Course for Cuba, which highlights the United States has not changed its objectives on Cuba, just its methods and tactics. Obama, to my knowledge, has never said that the blockade is just wrong, but he has said that it's an outdated approach, and also it has failed to advance our interests.
In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
Now, a few days later, on the 24th of December, the US State Department also stated that it was offering up to $11 million for change regime programs in Cuba. Now, nobody calls them that. They're actually called Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. Well, does that sound a little far-fetched? Well, I can understand that. So, in a few weeks I'll be doing a chapter on what the US aid really does in Cuba, or you can read about that now at the link below. To understand the possible future relations between Cuba and the United States, it's best to comprehend the difference between a blockade and an embargo that was first explained to me by Cubans themselves. A blockade is called this rather than an embargo because the latter would mean a legal territory action which prohibits commercial and trade with a specific country. Strikingly different, a blockade goes further and spreads extraterritorial, impacting in more than just commercial and trade. A blockade cuts and closes any bond in order to isolate a country from the outside world. This would include an effort to stop food, supplies, communications from either entering or leaving the country. It is designed to restrict economic, commercial, financial and other exchanges. The US blockade is estimated to have cost the Cuban economy more than billions of dollars. Also, from economists from Alba and from Havana University have calculated for every minute the blockade has remained in place for the last 5 decades has stopped Cuba's ability from either restoring or constructing 2 new homes. The US blockade of Cuba doesn't just have a devastating effect for Cubans in Cuba, it also affects citizens in other countries in the world, as in Europe and elsewhere. In 2012, British bank HSBC was fined by the US authorities for trading with Cuba. In 2014, French bank BNP Paribas were fined over $8 billion for trading with Cuba. And even the day before, on the 16th of December 2014, a German bank was fined for trading with Cuba. It's not only banks, it's also travel companies. Argentinian and Dutch travel companies were fined by the US for servicing travellers to Cuba. And the manufacturers of Red Bull, the energy drink, were also fined for filming a documentary on the island as well. You're probably wondering how the US gets away with this by fining corporations and businesses outside of the US. Well, it's quite simple. If you refuse to pay, the US will seize your assets within the US and you will no longer be able to trade. So I'll give you an example of 4 areas where the US blockade impacts Cuba. One would be around antiviral medicines and medicine in general, because US companies own the patent rights and they're preventative because of US laws to be able to go along and give those types of equipment and antiviral medicines for Cubans. Also, because of this, Cubans have to go further afield, which means all the prices increase because of dealing with other management and other agents, which all pile on their costs on top of that. Next is food. Cuba has to spend 50% more on freight costs because it has to go so far to import food across the world. When I buy toothpaste in Cuba, it's imported from Indonesia, and also I find other foods imported from Malaysia. The third would be education and the impact to the education establishments. This has resulted in, again, the cancellation of academic courses because Cuba either can't source the materials required or has to go so farther away the costs are impossible for Cuba to afford. Cuba is prohibited from using the US dollar around the world in banking and transactions. Therefore, they're not able to go along and leverage the support from places like the World Bank and the IMF. Despite the consequences of the blockade, healthcare in Cuba is universal and free and is ranked one of the highest in the world. Healthcare in Cuba is defined as a human right, unlike other countries. Also, education is free in Cuba, even at university level. Over 80% of the population go to university and another 9 go to a technical college. A bachelor's degree in Cuba is a minimum of 4 years and a master's is a minimum of 2. Cuba eradicated illiteracy in 1961 within the Cuban Literacy Campaign, where they taught over 770,000 people to read and write in less than 1 year by using people from the ages of 11 right up to university age, and they were called the Budadiscas. So what can we do to help Cuba and Cubans? Well, we can show our solidarity by visiting, listening, exchanging and sharing, not consuming and not judging. We also can go along and join solidarity campaigns. In the United Kingdom, there is the Cuban Solidarity Campaign. In Canada, there is the CNC Cuban Network. And within the United States, there is the Pastors of Peace. These are all very progressive organisations that support the Cuban people in making sure that they have a sovereign right in their own destiny and their own future. You can be part of these organisations and visit Cuba through these organisations as well. The other options also is speak to your congressman and your senator about removing the US blockade of Cuba.